You've got such a wealth of expertise spanning continents here today. I really wanted to start off by talking about the most basic of issues of church and state. And I'd like to kind of talk about how things differ and where the debates are in the countries that people come from, as well as Australia. And because of that, Sean, I want to start off with you, because when Richard Dawkins reviewed your book, he said that your book is important, particularly as we approach America's 2012 elections. The trend towards theocratic thinking in the United States is a danger not only for America, but for the entire world. Can you tell us about this, and is it in fact a trend? Is there something that's different about the relationship of religion to the state in the US at the moment?
Well, the 2012 election was a positive step from the perspective of secularism, in that in the presidency and in the U.S. Senate, there were positive results in the election for those who believe in separation of church and state. But I would caution, significant caution, in regard to the U.S. House of Representatives, which is still largely controlled by people who express theocratic viewpoints, including people who run the House Science Committee. Our state legislatures, where I can tell you a lot of the action is in terms of public policy, largely still controlled by many who support theocratic viewpoints, and the governorships as well. So it is a cautionary tale. And what I would say for an international audience, including people in Australia, is that in my book I write about that this is not something that was always true. If you go back to the 1960s in America, whether religious or non-religious, the religious right, the fundamentalist right, was really nowhere in the ball game. Barry Goldwater, the leader of the right-wing movement, said, "I have no respect for the religious right." And certainly those who were religious that many admired, like my parents, Bobby Kennedy, Dr. King, were talking about justice, economic issues, things like that. But the religious right decided that they were going to organize, and I have to tip my hat to them, because they were very successful in the United States, of going to the school board level, legislative level, and then rising up, perhaps with a culmination of George W. Bush's presidency. So it's very cautionary, particularly because they expressly, particularly the fundamentalist right, they view themselves as an export business. And they have exported that business of fundamentalism to places like Nigeria, and horrifically in Uganda, where we see, laws that actually say death penalty for being gay. These came from groups that advocated from the United States and with funding from the United States. And similarly with people like Mr. Pringle, I think of Australia as a place of Tim Minchin, who I love. But when I look at Reverend Phil Pringle, I look at a trend that I see very much in parallel to what was happening in the United States in the 1970s, and I hope our Australian friends, religious and non-religious, will work to stop that trend.
Can I just ask you to elaborate on that point just quickly? Because so what happened in the 1970s then? I mean, obviously a lot.
Yeah.
But what caused them to become so much, not just more active and vocal, but successful?
I think they had a well-organized, targeted campaign, particularly to the Republican Party, where they said, there was some sympathy there to begin with. They were spurred and activated by the Roe versus Wade decision about a woman's right to choose abortion. And the combination thereof provided a ground troop force where they were able to really now, today, they do have veto power over one of two major political parties in the United States, despite the fact that I would show you that the demographics in the United States show that a secular viewpoint is actually much larger in our society than is the fundamentalist viewpoint. Now, there's many in the spectrum in the middle, liberal, religious, and just simply ignoring the whole topic. But they organized that movement. Secular people have not done so, and that's really my job and why I'm here. We want, at the Richard Dawkins Foundation, to have an international, organized, secular movement, a human rights movement, particularly with regard to the issue of children and women's rights and gay people, saying there is harm from religious bias in law, including some areas in Australia, that I think we need to advocate for, both in our own nations, wherever they may be, and internationally.
Okay, I want to come back to what you think Australia's role might be in that secular movement, because I think it's a very fascinating point. But Anthony, can I just bring you in here? What are your observations of what Sean was saying, and also in the UK? Is this something that you feel is being exported? Is it an issue in politics in the UK?
Well, the UK has an established church, or rather England does, not the whole of the United Kingdom, and the head of state is the head of the church, which is very anomalous. I mean, it's a crazy situation,
Right.
which is what people regard as being our best defense against it. It's so crazy that it can't do any harm. But actually, it does do some harm. in the following way that a lot of the other religious bodies in England and elsewhere in the United Kingdom, they see the established church as having a variety of privileges. For example, 26 bishops of the Church of England can sit in the House of Lords. They don't always. They tend to have one on duty just in case God calls. But they also have at least four religious programs every day on the publicly funded broadcasting service, the BBC. And they're present at every public event. And so there's an enormous amount of, as it were, social reinforcement of the presence of the religious voice in public life and in the public square. And this motivates other religious organizations to want to get some of these privileges also. A very typical thing that happens is that I sometimes sit on a panel like this talking about secularism in the UK, and there will be 5 men, because of course there aren't any women in the hierarchies of religious bodies, and there will be a Catholic person and a Protestant person and a Jewish person and a Muslim person, and moi. And I'm the representative secularist, humanist, atheist.
Everyone else, yes.
Got the hairstyle, so they didn't have to ask a lady anyway. And the usual discussion is, I have to point out to you that these 4 folk, their traditions have been at war with one another for thousands of years. But now they agree because they want our tax dollars for their faith-based schools and so on. So the problem is that with the presence of an established church, it does encourage other bodies to say, we want some of that privilege also. What they're really looking for is what the church has, which is an amplifier for its voice out of all proportion to its actual constituency in the country. Right. As I understand it, in England, something like about 3% of the population go on a regular basis to a C of E service. There are other people who go to C of E services, because C of E does mean Christmas and Easter, so they tend to go to those services at that time. But still, the representation in public debate and moral discussions in Parliament, the influence on legislation, is out of all proportion to the actual footprint in the country.
Do you know the percentage that would say they believed in God compared to those who go to church?
It's hard to say. I mean, there are people who do have a very sincere faith commitment, and there are people who believe that they believe. There are also people who don't believe, but they think it's nice, it's a sort of communal thing. And the point that Sam Harris might have made when he was here recently is that the liberal, moderate, modest, socially minded wings of all the religious movements, who are, of course, very acceptable and do good work in society, but they do provide a kind of mask, in a way, for what happens at the more extreme ends of religious commitment. And they, of course, are the worry.
And I want to ask you about that, Frank, but just before we get to that, the extreme versus the moderation, can you characterise for us, though, where the tension in that debate is at? Do you see the church, you've talked about them as holding on to a historical influence. Is that ebbing? Is it under assault by these secular movements? Because when you talk about the number of bishops in the House of Lords, for example, I was interested to see in the recent debate, because the Anglican Church said no to female bishops, people started to say, well, really, should we accept that there's all male bishops in the House of Lords?
Yes, this is, I think, an interesting moment in a way for the Church, because there has been mounting pressure for disestablishment. And indeed, the last Archbishop of Canterbury was himself, I think, at least privately, in favour of disestablishment, because the connection between church and state is not always a comfortable one for either party. For example, during the administration of Mrs. Thatcher, there was quite a lot of criticism of the social policy, her social policy from the church. And this made the relationship a very uneasy one. And I think people in the church themselves felt that they were going to be in a much better position to criticize and to be activist if they were separate, if they weren't too much in bed with the government. So there is a groundswell, and of course with the increasing interest in secularism in particular and non-religious outlooks, and the debate about a non-religious approach to ethical questions and political questions, something of a momentum is, one feels anyway, starting to build. It wouldn't surprise me to see in the next decade or two disestablishment happen, and an official constitutional arrangement for separation of church and state, which would be very welcome.
And Frank, what about you? I mean, I was interested in Anthony's point there when he talks about how some of the more, I don't know, genial or social justice-oriented aspects of the church are acting as a mask for the more extreme parts. But you could argue the reverse was sometimes true as well. What's been your experience as a meddling priest?
Well, my experience as an Australian is that, you know, we're very different from the United States and from the UK. What Anthony's just said, you know, you might move towards disestablishment. Could I recommend it to you? We have had it in Australia from the beginning, and we find it works quite well. So the idea that you would have constitutional arrangements in place, where of course under our constitution, section 116, you don't have an established church. And I think even those of us who are religious in Australia would think that that's a very good thing. I don't hear too many people, not even the strongest Sydney Anglicans, saying that, well, we should have a constitutional recognition of the Anglican Church. And in terms of the thing Sean's been raising, I'd say that, of course, our traditions are so different that, of course, you were founded in part of people seeking religious freedom. We were founded as a penal colony. It's a very different way to begin a society, but also you with your constitutionally entrenched Bill of Rights, then it means that there will always be greater agitation about these sorts of questions where your Supreme Court purports to hand down, as if on high, the definitive answer on questions like abortion. That's never the case in Australia. And in Australia, it's far more the product of the general discussion that goes on in the community generally. So that I think the place of religion in Australia, even secularist though we be, I think that generally people of goodwill say, well, it doesn't matter what your religious belief might be, but the fact that there are a lot of health, education, welfare services which are delivered, particularly in the most pressing of circumstances, then the fact that people have a religious perspective, well, in a sense, good luck to them, provided the service is delivered in a cost-effective and responsible fashion.
And Prue, what's your take on that? How do you see us as being different from the US in this exact regard?
I think Australians are pretty sceptical about religion, for probably the historical reasons that Frank's alluded to. But I think they have great respect for it. I think Australians might not be observant, but they accept the goodness of the values that it was based on. As I think everybody agrees, there can be extreme versions of it, as there are of political philosophies. But, I mean, let's think about modern human rights. Modern human rights are based on Judeo-Christian ethics, and in particular that great commandment of Jesus, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So we can't really escape thousands of years of various competing philosophies in the Roman world, in the Greek world, and in our own modern world, and the way they have drawn together the best ideas about how we should care for each other. And as I say, we've ended up with a legal system and a human rights system that flows from that very much reflects a religious background. But I think Australians are wary of enabling, of allowing the church in any formal way.
Right, but given you're talking about a historical background, how is it informing current debates? I mean, because there's a lot of heat around Tony Abbott, for example, and about his views on women's reproductive rights and how much that's informed by religion. Do you see that? What do you think that reflects?
Well, I can't speak for Tony Abbott, but I certainly think that some people would have a view of abortion, for example, that would be based on their view of life. Others would have a view about abortion that would be based on their view about the risks you take every time you take a life, which is quite possible in a humanist context. You do not need to be a Christian to be concerned about abortion. So I think the religious aspect of debates like the abortion debate, and indeed the gay rights debate, are vastly inflated. I mean, if you look at so many things where we inflate the role of religion. For example, we all talk about the seal of confession and how outrageous we think it is that priests shouldn't have to report when they suspect somebody of child sexual abuse. But we forget that doctors, psychologists, and a whole range of other professionals are also covered by exactly that same part of the Evidence Act. So religion, for quite understandable reasons, gets sometimes a worse rap than it needs to get, a worse rap than it should have. But that's all part of the wonderful tension of, I think, a very open society where everybody's got an opinion. You're all here today, you'll all have them. And that's great. And that's what keeps extremism in this country in balance and in check.
I think Sean's wanting to leap in there, yes.
Well, I respectfully do disagree with some of those points. First of all, I think, and AC or others might be better able to quote, but I think it was Pittacus, the Greek philosopher several centuries before Christ, who offered the golden rule of do unto others as you have been doing to you. So
so we all agree on what's good.
Well, and I praise those, including Father here, who I've seen read much of his great works on human rights, and I respect that many religious people do. However, I will say that when you say on women's rights and on equality for gay people, and I will add children, that it is overwhelmingly, you look at the numbers, and I always, as a politician, look at where the dollars are, the overwhelming force of money against equality for gay people, the overwhelming force of voices against women's reproductive control of their own bodies is a religious voice. Are there minor variations on either side? But the primary motivating factor is a religious viewpoint. It gives the imprimatur to actions which I will openly say, when Pope Francis said about how equality for gay people was something from, I think the phrase was the king of lies, meaning Satan. Well, first of all, I don't think Satan exists, and I find that a very bizarre assertion. But to me, it is an immoral assertion. I will say it flat out. To not treat gay people equally is an immoral assertion. And it comes from religion. This is the distinctive point for me. There's some guy at the pub who might say, let's treat women like dirt. But he doesn't get the imprimatur, the authority of some kind of moral glaze over what he says. But with religion, you can say women shall be treated differently. 115 guys vote for a pope that has a control over a landmass the size of France and billions of dollars under the control. 115 old men make that decision. I respectfully disagree that should ever happen. I think the victims of sexual abuse should be voting on what happens with all that money.
Anthony, I just want to ask you, because Sean's brought up the Pope, and I know in September 2010 you were a part of a group of 55 who wrote a letter to The Guardian protesting the visit of Pope Benedict XVI just to the state. Is that right? Can you tell us what that was about?
Well, the thought there was that the church had known about problems relating to child sexual abuse and had taken action to protect people who had been perpetrators of that abuse, had moved them to other parishes, or had relieved them of their responsibilities, and had made every effort to conceal it and to make sure that the authorities didn't get hold of the people who had been to blame. And if anybody was the head of a major organization which had attempted a criminal conspiracy to conceal very, very serious crimes, they would get into trouble. But in the case of the church, that didn't happen. And so what we did do when the Pope came to the UK was to say that we were going to try to get him arrested. It didn't work. And it didn't work for the very good reasons that there are lots of vested interests involved. Yes. Just before we pursue that, because I know Father Brennan may wish to comment, and just before we leave history, if we may go back to the point that Prue made about our values, human rights and so on, being based on Judeo-Christian tradition. Sean made a very important point, which is that for nearly 1,000 years before the Christian church became influential, really influential and dominant in Europe, there'd been a tremendous tradition, very rich, deep tradition of thinking about ethical matters. And indeed, most of what people believe to be characteristic of Christian ethics is in fact not Christian ethics at all. You have to remember that if you read indeed the documents of the New Testament, you'll see that the core of the ethical teaching is give away all your money, take no thought for tomorrow, don't marry, keep the wicks of your lamp trimmed because the kingdom is nearly upon you. And after a couple of centuries, when people were looking at their sundials and things hadn't worked out as they thought they might when those scriptures were written, they realized they needed more ethical content, and as it happens, metaphysical content too, which came into the church through Neoplatonism. I mean, it's forgotten, that Paul said, when you die, you will You will lie in the earth until the last trump, and then you will resurrect with a new body. I've always thought that would be rather nice, a sort of rippling six-pack and everything.
Be nice if you get to pick them, yes.
But then, after 3 or 4 centuries, the doctrine of the immortal soul was adopted from Platonism. So it's really Greek philosophy all the way, including the ethics. It's very important. And there is an important disagreement about the Golden Rule also. Sean is quite right that it does predate Christianity, but it was the Enlightenment of the 18th century which taught us to think, as G.B. Shaw, in fact, summed it up, saying, Golden Rule says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And he said, under no circumstances should you do to others what you'd like them to do to you, because they may not like it. And it's a really important point. You have to see other people in their individuality. I mean, to be a good neighbor to other human beings is to see the difference and to recognize and respect it and to allow them their particularity and their space. Indeed, this underwrites the whole concept of human rights in a way. We're not all just one thing, and certainly I'm not the benchmark or the standard for what everybody else likes. So it's important that we should get away from the one-size-fits-all view, which is what religious moralities tend to be, and to think of the great plurality and diversity of human experience.
What do you think about that, Frank?
Well, there's been quite a range of issues.
Yes, no, but I also remember that, you respond, but I'm also interested in the plurality and diversity within the church as well, because when we talk about church and state, there's not just a single voice coming from the church, even though we tend to assume that it's got a particular conservative position.
But getting back to those voices, I mean, I would agree with Anthony and Sean. A lot of people, including probably the majority in this audience, would take their lights from the Enlightenment and Greek philosophy, and that helps to give them a worldview. There are others of us who find all of that very helpful, but find it can be complemented, in my case, by the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, in my case, by the development of a Catholic tradition, in my case, by a Jesuit tradition, which we now find embodied in some of the, I think, splendid responses we've seen with the election of this Pope Francis. But the question is, well, why do we find it threatening that there be a plurality of ways in which people come to express these worldviews? The critical issue becomes then, what does the individual bring within the pluralistic democratic society in order to agitate what might be the application of these worldviews to the other? And so to go through seriatim the issues that have been raised, I mean, Sean, and being an American, you'd expect it. There'll be a lot of talk about abortion, but it's not the same political issue here that it is there. It's the same moral issue, but here it's not the same political issue because there it was purportedly resolved by an unelected Supreme Court. We don't have any of that. So there, someone like Bill Clinton can come out and say what? It should be safe, rare and legal.
Yes.
Catholic bishops over there can get very upset at Bill Clinton. Catholic politicians here, Tony Abbott, Christina Keneally, what do? They simply invoke the Bill Clinton line. Do we have Catholic bishops getting upset about that? Not as far as I know. I mean, basically, we have a different way here of looking at what should be the applicable law or policy.
And the role of the conscience vote in parliaments, in Australian parliaments, is very significant.
I mean, treatment of people who are gay. I mean, yes, adverse treatment of people who are gay is immoral. Fine. I fully subscribe to that notion. I still say that for me, you might think me old-time, but in a pluralist democratic society, I think we've still got some discussion to do on the distinction between civil unions and marriage. And I don't want to put it in terms of doing in gays, but I do want to have a bit more of a discussion about some of the issues to do with children and reproduction. And when it comes to issues such as human rights and the underlying reality of them, on most issues, I mean, all of us on this stage will probably agree on most human rights issues, but it's at the edges of life that, yes, we can speak of women's reproductive rights, but what do we do in terms of our moral discourse about the rights of the vulnerable who happen to be, at that stage, unborn? Some will say, well, that's not a relevant issue in terms of philosophical discourse. Others will say it is. At the other end of life, there'll be questions. And in terms of the underlying safety net we set up in a society, how do we really accord universal dignity to all? Now, some, like Anthony, and I fully respect them, say, look, no, we've got enough hardware to do that philosophically with the Greeks and the Enlightenment. But there are others of us who say, oh, we're not quite sure that the person who's truly dependent, truly irrational, that enough can be done with those concepts in terms of universal dignity. And for some of us, we find religious belief helps to buttress that. And what's wrong with putting that in the mix in trying to find what is the best way to accord the universal dignity of all? I think these are the sorts of political and legal questions, and they can be done respectfully without slagging off or laughing at other people's world's views simply because we don't accept them. We distinguish people's moral discourse from what we think should be the law or the public policy in a robust, pluralistic, democratic society. And the final issue raised in terms of sex abuse, etc., yes, one of the great things, thank God we don't live in a theocratic state. Thank God I don't live in a country which is dominated by the Vatican. Thank God when something like sexual abuse of children is raised that I can say, well, I may be a Catholic priest, but I'm also part of a pluralist democratic society where the rule of law is strong and said the rights of children must be absolutely protected.
Absolutely.
And we need state intervention to ensure that they're not the abusers. Aren't we at Edom?
Yes. I'm sure you want to say some things, but I just want to bring Prue in because you haven't spoken for a while there, Prue. Okay, what do we need to be talking about? Is there good that religion does in public life then? Is that a conversation we need to be having?
Well, you can't always tell whether what is good in a public policy debate is because is being driven by religion or not. As we've already agreed, you can have a whole lot of ethical positions that don't depend on you having a religious view. But I think people need belief. And of course, the great role of religion, really, in history is to enforce a social conduct. Horribly, sometimes, not very nicely. The threat that you'll go to hell if you don't do the right thing. But it is that threat that's hung over societies for... well, a long time, that's kept societies sort of disciplined. And, I mean, that's, if you like, that's a non-Christian explanation for the role of Christianity or the role of Islam. I almost feel that if you didn't have a religion, somebody would have to invent one because of the capacity for social control.
And also social change when you think about, say, the Victorian times, the evangelicals were very active, the Jesuits have been very active in the past too. They've sometimes been at the forefront of social movements involved in the civil rights. But anyway...
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. And, I mean, slavery was once condoned by the church and the church moved with the times. It moved slowly, unfortunately, but it moved. I think we need to give people space. And in a country like Australia's, I absolutely can't speak for the US, but in our country, where people are so confident about their views and so willing to be confronted and to confront, I don't think it matters very much. You have to watch it because there is always going to be a tendency, I think, for extremes and control, people who wish to control others to take over. But, I mean, that's true of political philosophy. I mean, the totalitarian philosophies were just as evil. In fact, you might say Stalin killed more people than a lot of religions.
No, I can see you're almost leaping out of your chair, Sean. and I would like you to respond to that. But I also am very eager for you to talk about Australia. Because you say that, you've got some insights on Australia. You say it's very important in terms of the secular movement. We've always seen ourselves as a secular culture. Our great historian Manning Clark said we were the kingdom of nothingness where no religion could take root. You could argue whether that's nothing or something. But what's your take on kind of where Australia is at in the secular movement?
Well, first, I want to learn from others. I don't claim to or presume to say I know about Australia, but things that some Australians have raised with me that do raise concern as a matter of public policy that I hope we could discuss. And to me, this is an issue of human rights for children. As has been pointed out, I write about 10 areas of law in the U.S. in my book where there's religious bias in law and where there are victims of that bias. And that's not as pervasive here in the nation of Australia. However, one thing that is present in Australia that's not so in the United States is this direct government funding for schools. And when, as I understand, when this first arose, perhaps you had the Anglican and the Catholic schools primarily that were the beneficiaries of this direct funding. However, and again, I draw the thread of this, they'll say it's an export business from the United States, the fundamentalists will, fundamentalist Protestants. And now you're seeing in Australia a trend towards schools, direct government funding for schools in Australia. Some of these schools get more of your tax money than do the so-called government schools.
That's not true.
Teaching things, well, there are some of the Baptist schools and others, I've read the statistics on this, where they teach things like that the world was created in 6 24-hour days. This sort of thing.
That's not allowed.
Well, I think it is true that there are schools that get that. Let me just finish the thought. Direct funding from the government. And my hope would be that we would all have agreement, whether we're religious or not religious, that there's something problematic about that there's a human right for a child to learn accurate information about the origin of the universe.
And the Board of Studies absolutely requires it.
Yeah.
I mean, you're absolutely right. And guess what? It happens. That's what the Board of Studies does. They set down what must be taught that is what must be taught in a science course. And if you want to teach the crazy stuff, the 6 hours, 6 days and 24, whatever it is, then that's a special subject. It's not to be examined, and it is not to be referred to in examinations. So I think the state does exactly the right thing. It ensures that every child, which was your requirement, every child gets taught the proper science and the proper biology, particularly the origins of the world.
But if they also teach something like that we will be warriors for Christ in a world where he is not dominant, I mean, this is a quote from some of the religious schools here. I'm worried that that would grow, and I would respectfully hope that we invest in public education where these kinds of things do not happen on the campus. I mean, that would be my hope.
And I do need to move over to this side, but I just want to quickly come back to the question I asked you about the involvement of Australians in the secular movement, because I understand you have quite a few that are involved in your group, for example.
Well, yeah, I also manage or edit the Facebook page for Richard Dawkins, and I am proud to report that more Australians per capita are Dawkinsian, if I can invent a word, than any other nation on earth. More are participating in it, and I think you folks can be the leaders of an international human rights movement.
So this might highlight to you that the threat of a religious takeover in Australia is probably not very great.
But we didn't think that in the 1970s in the United States either. I would just offer that cautionary note. Nobody thought the religious right was anywhere in the U.S. in the early 1970s. But if you've got a platform like a school to teach children things like I've described, well...
Sean, you are sounding like an Old Testament prophet of doom.
Join us!
Wait, we're back to your book cover now. That's Armageddon.
As I understand it, one of the differences in the voting systems between your system and our system is that at the American system you don't have to vote. We have compulsory voting. Yeah. And when you have a system where people can choose to vote, as I understand it, it drives debate, the two sides to an extreme positions. Yeah. For example, both Democrats and Republicans, according to the research, nominate abortion as the number one issue they go to vote on. You would never get that here because everybody has to vote, and those sorts of issues just get swallowed up in the mix of can we have a government that runs us properly, please?
Right. Now, Anthony, yes.
I just wanted to comment on Sean's remark about how many Dawkins followers there are in Australia. It's proof that the Australians are more highly evolved than the But I'd also like to comment on the faith school issue. I mean, for me, the phrase faith school is a contradiction in terms. And I think education at all levels ought to be not teaching people what to think, but how to think. That's absolutely crucial. And the great problem, really the great problem with religious education in schools, if it's doctrinal, if it's not education about all the different faiths and their traditions and histories, their outlooks, taught as a sociological and historical subject, but taught doctrinally, is that it perpetuates the divisions that religion too often creates in society. I remember when my youngest daughter was in kindergarten, she was at a little school in South London where 36 different languages were spoken in that school. And people from every conceivable background, ethnicity, culture, religion, their children were represented in this school. And these 4- and 5-year-olds simply got on with one another. And they didn't mind, whether this one was, liberal, that one was Labour, this one was Muslim, that one was Catholic. They were just children together. And we, adults, have to teach them that they're different. We have to impose on them conceptions of being separate from other people and different beliefs. And if we were able to get away from that, it would be transformative for our world. Especially on the question of the sort of moral dimension of things that you were mentioning. I have to say, with great respect, the idea that you have to have an invisible policeman who watches you all the time and sees you even when you're on your own in bed at night, is as a way of reinforcing morality, is not a great way of doing it. It would be so much better if people were invited or challenged, really, to think for themselves a bit about how they're going to relate to other people and what their responsibilities are. And it's not beyond imagination that the whole world, everybody, all of us, all human beings, might share very fundamental agreements about this, about how we're to relate to one another, and not on the basis of doctrines that separate us. I mean, I often say on the question of faith schooling that 2 words are the most powerful argument against faith-based schooling, and those 2 words are Northern Ireland. Because you only have to look at the fact that those 2 communities were educated separately, lived in segregated ways in their different ghettos, and look at the perpetuated conflicts that happened there. And surely the world is now growing too mature for that kind of thing. We've got to get past it.
Now, Frank, I really need to ask you about education and about schooling, because this is something that Jesuits have done for centuries. Do you want to respond to what's been said?
Yes, I'd offer 2 responses. I'm superficially attracted to what Anthony says in terms of course, kids see themselves as all alike, and why do we need to inculcate difference? But given as we do mature in terms of our learning, each of us in some way comes to some sort of comprehensive worldview. Now, yours is more informed by the Enlightenment and humanism than mine would be. Now, if we're going to say, well, look, what we've got to do in education is ensure that no comprehensive worldview is trumps, fine. Now, we're going to say, in fact, there shouldn't be any teaching about comprehensive worldviews because we want everyone to remain in this childlike situation where we will see things as being the same. I see it at the moment in Canada, for example. We Jesuits, we've been in the business of education for 4 or 5 centuries, and yes, we've got some fine products of ours in our federal parliament at the moment. We won't go there. But at the moment in Canada, one of our Jesuit schools in Quebec, there's proceedings presently in the Supreme Court of Canada because the state wants to insist on the mode of ethical instruction that will be given in the school. Now, the Jesuits have said, well, look, we think we've got a bit of a handle on ethical instruction, and we don't think it should just be the preserve of the state. So I think one of the mistakes we often make in discussion about education is we work on what I regard as sort of bipolar notion, where there's the individual and the state. And it's the state that's going to provide, this good, free, secular education which is devoid of values or whatever, or that includes values which everyone would subscribe to, regardless of what their religious or non-religious beliefs would be. But if we take a more triangular view of the individual, but I as an individual, I also have multiple affiliations. I'm members of various groups. I'm also a member of a religious community. But the question is, what's the role of the state over against those communities, particularly when it comes to an issue of education? So I think the state is quite within its bounds in insisting on the basic standards, the educational standards that should be complied with. But where we would differ, and obviously I would differ with most of the audience here, would be I wouldn't want the state prescribing unduly what I regard as the comprehensive worldviews in which people are to be educated.
What if the state insisted that every little child was brought up to be a liberal?
I would
We
think that would be
couldn't
wrong.
have that.
Don't
No,
do
no,
it.
no. I mean a capital L. Exactly. I mean, in other words, the state is not is not in a healthy position to decide personal values, and that's all Frank's saying.
With great respect to both of you, it's not an opposition between the state saying what people should think and the Jesuits saying what people should think. It's the people who should be doing some thinking for themselves, and that's what an education should be asking them to do.
You won't hear any objection from a Jesuit to that.
No, that's right. Well, anyway, now,
Not if the Jesuits can get them before the age of 7. Anyway.
no, we're talking about the 7 Up series as well, Greg,
Yes.
which was one of the greatest things I've ever seen in a documentary level. But Prue, I want to ask you about something else different at this point. What do you make of the inequality of women within the church compared to the relative equality of women in the broader culture? And by this I mean by being allowed or not to be priests or bishops or to be in positions of leadership. And do you think that a broader or secular culture should be placing pressure on the church to change or not?
I think it's incredibly troubling. I find it deeply objectionable within my own church, particularly this diocese.
You're an Anglican?
I'm
yep.
an Anglican. And I find it extremely troubling. I do, however, happen to believe in freedom of association, and if you don't like that church, you can always go and make your own. The problem is the assets. The Diocese of Sydney has its control, and the reason there aren't breakaways from the Diocese of Sydney is because the Diocese of Sydney is extremely wealthy. And unfortunately, this bedevils the church that it's also a very wealthy institution, the Anglican Church, and also the Catholic Church, which is something we could get to a little later probably. But no, I find it very troubling. And I think one of the wonderful things about religion is because it's about philosophy and a relationship with God and a set of personal values that then develop into a shared set of values, that it's possible to change them. I mean, the church would no more defend slavery today than it would, murder. But it did once. And what that shows is that religion is capable and is a vehicle for the pursuit of good as well as evil.
And if it does not, does that undermine its case for tax exemption, for example, and for the privileges which were mentioned earlier?
Well, I've never had a collection tax deductible, and I think you will find that the only tax exemptions or the tax advantages the church enjoys are when it's applied to investments in...
Okay, well, anti-discrimination exemptions, for example.
Look, when I was commissioner, it drove me nuts. Of course you shouldn't have sex discrimination based on religious belief in the absolute sense. But on the other hand, freedom of association. And that, in the end, was where I came down, that the Sex Discrimination Act makes very clear that there are certain parts of religious observation that are exempt from the Act because that's considered to be part of one's personal beliefs. I found that myself very frustrating, but I accept that the danger of not accepting that, it's a bit like Voltaire. It's a bit like Voltaire. You know, I defend to the death your right to disagree with me. And the danger of not having that exemption is that you then are denying people the right to believe what they want to believe, even though and half the people in this room presumably find it deeply offensive.
And I want to go back to secularism in just a moment before we go to question times. But Frank, just quickly, as someone who's within the church, how do you see the gender debate and do you think it's problematic?
Well, in the Catholic Church, I think it's highly problematic. And I think, I mean, one of the welcome developments, particularly in our part of the world, is in the last 50 years, the progress which has been made of women being at the table. I mean, I'm one of those men who rejoices in the fact that regardless of her personality or policies, you know, that we do have a woman Prime Minister, that we do have a woman Governor-General, that we do have 3 of the 7
But what about a woman
judges.
bishop or
What's
a woman
that?
pope? What about a female pope or a female bishop?
I fervently hope and pray the day will come. I know that...
A little way off. I think it's a little way off, yes.
Now, as I was joking with a few of you beforehand, we may well agree on lots of things. I'm the only one who'll get into trouble for agreeing after it's over. But basically, I think, I mean, the trouble with the Roman Catholic Church and where patience has to be asked for is unlike the Anglican Church, for example, where you can decide things diocese by diocese or country by country. Rome can only work universally. So to make the leap which has been made in societies like Australia over the last 50 years, to do it all of a sudden with the Roman Church, I hope and pray it'll come. It's not here yet, and the fact that it's not here yet means that, yes, we are part of an antediluvian social institution at the moment, but it's a church where I stick with it because basically I think tradition and authority matter, and it's worth sticking in to try and see the development of that tradition and authority so that the full human dignity of all persons can be accommodated within the church as well as without. And yes, for as long as there's not that equality, makes it all the more difficult for people like me to sound at all credible in the public square in talking about some of the more difficult human rights issues where there's not the same groundswell of public support, you know, asylum seekers or whatever. So it's a critically important question.
Right. I want to touch on with Anthony and Sean. We know what religion looks like, largely. We know what certainly religion looks like in relation to the state. We don't know what secularism looks like as a movement or as something. If we talk about Manning Clark's Kingdom of Nothingness, if we talk about it, no, this is something, and this is something which develops from natural law or from a series of ethics. And can I just ask you, because your book, The Good Book, The Humanist Bible, was culled, you told me earlier, from over 30 years of kind of collecting wisdom and insights from all of your readings. What do you see the secular movement as looking like and possibly achieving?
Well, actually, we've got a number of historical examples. China, for example, has always been a secular country. People think that it's not, and they cite Confucianism and Buddhism. Of course, Buddhism in its origins is a philosophy, not a religion. Yeah. The Buddha asked his disciples not to make him a god and not to turn it into a religion. But we've all seen the life of Brian, so we know what happens when you find the sandal, you know. And the Chinese are, just to generalize for a moment, are a very superstitious people, but they're not a religious people. They don't have a transcendent agency who delivers commandments and so on. So we have a wonderful example in a very ancient, continuous societal tradition there. And of course, the ancient world, the classical world, was a secular world also. It had religions in the plural, but they were not at all like the faith religions that we're familiar with now, because they were public observances for social cohesion. One reason why Christians were persecuted in the Roman Empire was because they wouldn't sign up to this tremendously important social get-together where all the different communities of the empire would come together and, quote-unquote, worship the emperor. But really it was a kind of external thing, not something internal as Christianity is. So we do have plenty of examples of what such a dispensation would look like. And functionally, I think, almost all the post-Enlightenment developed democracies of the world, of the Western world, because they are all functionally secular, really, are our best example. The reason why there is so little, relatively speaking, religious extremism in Australia or in the UK or in the United States is because of our secular dispensation, the rule of law, institutions which try to promote and manage social justice. Look at today's Pakistan or Afghanistan or Iraq, and there you see traditions which don't have that post-Enlightenment development are rife with the most tragic religious divisions. You know, people are being murdered in Pakistan because they're the wrong kind of Muslim. And this is an example of how things could go if we don't have enough of a secular attitude in society built into its institutions and practices. So we have lots of examples, and we see our own societies developing out of the sort of Eurocentric tradition, moving little by little in the right direction, but there's always a step back for every 3 or 4 steps forward, because cyclically you get the religious voice or religious movements or religious concerns sort of cropping up again, as they have been in the last decade or two. And those of us who have a secular outlook really have to stand up and be counted and say, look, do believe what you like. But we've got to get away from this business where people say, I believe so-and-so, so you're not allowed to do such and such. I believe so-and-so, so you're not allowed to watch so-and-so. The business of imposing attitudes from a very particular kind of sectarian point of view is something which secularism has been busy trying to get rid of, trying to make the public forum a place where all voices are welcome. Of course, religious voices have every right to be heard and to put their point of view, make their case. But they've got to see themselves for what they are, interest groups. And they ought not to get the amplification that comes out of being a religion. They should take their place in the queue.
You want to go quickly, and then I want to go to Sean. Did you want to say something just quickly?
I just want to say I'd happily sign up to that secularism any day. And I just make the observation, I lived at King's Cross for 14 years, and I think that, the secular space of the streets of the Cross are wonderful, but I think it'd be a dreadful place if it were not for St Vincent's Hospital and the Wayside Chapel.
Correct.
Well,
Sean, yes.
Yeah. First, I want to commend both of you because I know that you have taken action for secular values that have been very important for human rights in Australia and beyond, and I appreciate that, and many religious people do that. However, particularly when, if I could respectfully disagree, you talked about the voice of authority. And for me, that's exactly the problem that I found in day-to-day life as a politician, or even when I was a kid. I remember when Life of Brian, when I was a kid, and the church told us, you're not supposed to watch this movie. I said, why wouldn't I want to watch a movie? And so that spurred me to watch what I thought was very funny, but also an intellectually rigorous discussion of religious thinking. That's really what Life of Brian was, and it definitely helped me in walking down a path to when I was a politician. And I don't know if you've had this experience, but for me in our committee, I was on judiciary, which had women's reproductive rights and equality for gay people was within the jurisdiction of our committee. And I would sit there as a lowly politician listening to the public testimony. And whenever I heard the word moral, it came from a religious person.
The word
Yep.
Moral.
More.
Yes. And they would say, morality requires, and then the result of this morality, as they sometimes wagged their finger at me, was that we could discriminate against gay people, or that women would be denied control over their own bodies. Or another one that I saw, and I think there's parallels here as well, where they would say, the janitor at my religious organization, or the accountant at my religious organization, we can literally point to them and say, you're a Jew, you're fired. You're a Muslim, you're fired.
They can't do that here.
Well, I'm very glad that you do that, but we saw that. And for me, that is a pathway where they were pointing to morality and pointing to authority, and I thought, is that where morality comes from? And this isn't any hostility to religious people, because I feel like the word morality has been stolen, particularly by the fundamentalist end of the spectrum.
Well, take it back.
Well, exactly. But where do we see it taken to? Whenever I heard this, it had often to do with sexuality, whereas I think Dr. King and others took it to another place, where he said that when we had no prayer in schools, period, that he fully supported that decision, and who was on the other side? Well, George Wallace, the racist leader of Alabama. So I worry about this fundamentalist trend. I think we can have common cause with other liberal religious people for that secular square, but I hope that we could work together for an international human rights movement where we say that there is increasing secularism because, as a study came out from University of California the other day, you don't need religion for that. And then when they did a study of people and asked them to assess ethical and moral views, equal treatment of women and others, those who more thought in a scientific way we're the more likely to oppose violence against women and to speak out for human rights. So I think the scientific and Enlightenment view is the one that really is the pathway to a positive and more moral world.
Okay. Thanks so much to our panel.